The bullets recovered from the bodies of innocent civilians in Cold War Europe didn't always come from across the Iron Curtain. Often they came from hidden stockpiles buried beneath the very soil they were meant to defend. For decades, a secret network of ghost soldiers lived among the population, waiting for a Soviet invasion that never arrived. But as archives began to creak open in the early 90s, a chilling question emerged. If the enemy never came, what did these secret armies do with their weapons and their training? The answer lies in a shadowy project known as Operation Gladio, a name that translates to the sword. But for many, it felt more like a dagger held to the throat of the public it was sworn to protect. In the summer of 1990, the Italian Prime Minister stood before a stunned parliament and admitted to the existence of a clandestine paramilitary structure. It was supposed to be a stay-behind army, a fail-safe designed by Western intelligence to conduct unconventional warfare and sabotage should an Eastern force ever sweep across the continent. Every NATO member state had its own version, hidden from the public and even from most of their own elected officials. These were the ultimate patriots, chosen for their unwavering resolve and their willingness to operate in the darkest corners of the state. They were trained in the arts of the silent strike, the improvised device, and the manipulation of public opinion. They were the invisible shield, but as the decades passed, the line between defense and provocation began to blur until it disappeared entirely. The discovery began not in a high-level briefing room, but in the dusty files of a persistent magistrate named Felice Casson. He was investigating a decades-old tragedy in the small village of Petiano, an event that had long been blamed on fringe militants. However, something about the evidence didn't align. The materials used were of a military grade, rarely found in the hands of street radicals. As Casson pulled on a single loose thread, the entire tapestry of national security began to unravel. He found himself staring at a secret organization that existed outside the law, funded by taxpayer money and operating with a mandate that bypassed democratic oversight. This was the first glimpse of Gladio, a revelation that would send shockwaves through the capitals of Europe and leave the public wondering who was truly responsible for the years of chaos known as the Years of Lead. During the 60s and 70s, a phenomenon known as the strategy of tension gripped the streets of Italy and beyond. It was a period defined by sudden, horrific acts of public violence that seemed designed to terrify the populace into the arms of a more authoritarian government. Incidents occurred in banks, at crowded political rallies, and most infamously, at the Bologna train station. The official narratives almost always pointed the finger at extreme political groups, creating a climate of fear and mutual suspicion. Yet as investigators looked closer in later years, they found a recurring pattern of evidence pointing back to the stay-behind networks. The theory emerged that these secret armies were not just waiting for a foreign invader. They were actively managing the internal political landscape, ensuring that certain parties never gained enough power to shift the balance of the era. Those who managed the stay-behind cells operated under a mindset where the ends always justified the means. In their eyes, if the public was leaning toward an ideology that threatened the status quo, a shock to the system was deemed necessary to restore order. This wasn't about malice in the traditional sense, but about a cold, calculated belief that the survival of the state was more important than the lives of the individuals within it. It was a form of radical pragmatism that operated in the silence between the laws, where the traditional concepts of right and wrong were replaced by the harsh mathematics of geopolitical survival. The gardener, so afraid of a hypothetical pest, began to treat the very flowers he protected with a heavy hand. The secrets were not confined to Italy. In Belgium, A series of senseless events at supermarkets in the mid-80s left the nation paralyzed. The attackers were highly disciplined, showing military precision in their movements and vanishing into the night without a trace. They took very little, suggesting that their goal was not profit, but the creation of a pervasive sense of insecurity. For years, the case remained a total mystery, but as the Gladio revelations came to light, suspicions turned toward the clandestine structures of the state. The possibility that domestic security forces were involved in such events to justify increased police presence or political shifts remains one of the most haunting, unresolved chapters of European history. In Turkey, the stay-behind network was known as the counter-guerrilla, and its influence was said to permeate every level of the military and judicial systems. Allegations of extrajudicial actions, staged provocations, and the suppression of dissent followed the trail of this deep structure for decades. The pattern remained consistent. Whenever the political stability of the nation was perceived to be at risk, the invisible hand of the secret army would reach out from the shadows. These organizations were built on a foundation of absolute secrecy, where even the members often didn't know the full scope of the hierarchy they served. They operated as a state within a state, accountable to no one but their handlers in the intelligence community. The logistics of these operations were staggering. Across Western Europe, secret bunkers were constructed in forests, beneath private homes, and even under ancient ruins. These caches were filled with high-tech communications gear, resources for bribery, and enough weaponry to equip a small army. Thousands of recruits were vetted and trained in secret facilities, often believing they were the last line of defense for civilization. They were taught that they were the chosen few, the only ones who truly understood the gravity of the threat. This indoctrination created a culture of extreme loyalty and a disconnect from the democratic values they were supposedly protecting. When you spend your life preparing for the end of the world, the rules of the world as it currently exists begin to feel irrelevant. The official response to these revelations was a mix of quiet admissions and frantic damage control. Some governments claimed the networks were purely defensive and had never been used for internal interference. Others insisted that if any deviations had occurred, they were the work of rogue elements acting without authorization. But the sheer scale of the networks and the consistency of the accidents and misattributions over 40 years made the rogue element theory difficult to maintain. It suggested instead a systemic approach to governance that viewed the public not as a constituency to be served, but as a mass to be managed through psychological pressure. As the Cold War ended and the old walls fell, the immediate justification for these secret armies vanished. But the infrastructure of secrecy is not so easily dismantled. The habits of mind, the hidden channels of funding, and the deep-seated belief in the necessity of clandestine intervention often survive the conflicts that birthed them. The story of Gladio is a reminder that in the struggle between great powers, the first casualty is often the transparency required for a free society. It raises a haunting question that still echoes in the modern era. In a world of complex threats and shifting loyalties, how do we know if the people sworn to keep us safe are following a script we never agreed to? The legacy of these shadow armies remains a mosaic of unanswered questions. How many of the tragedies of the 20th century were truly the work of the groups who took credit for them? And how many were orchestrated by the very institutions meant to prevent them? The archives remain partially closed, protected by national security clauses that may never expire. The survivors of the attacks continue to seek the truth, their lives forever altered by events that may have been triggered by their own protectors. This is the dark thriller of history, where the lines between the protector and the threat are often blurred, and the battlefield is the mind of the ordinary citizen. Today, the term Gladio has become a shorthand for the deep-seated fear that the state is not always what it appears to be. It serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and the influence of total secrecy. When we look back at the footage of the Bologna station or the supermarket events in Belgium, we are no longer just looking at acts of terror. We are looking at the potential fingerprints of a ghost. The sword that was meant to be drawn only in the event of an invasion may have been used to sharpen the edges of a society that was deemed too difficult to control. The transition from the Cold War to the modern age of global uncertainty has only changed the names of the players, not the fundamental nature of the game. The concept of the stay behind has evolved into more sophisticated forms of surveillance and narrative control. The shadows have simply moved into the digital realm, where the manipulation of information has replaced the placement of physical devices. But the core tension remains the same: the struggle between the need for security and the right to the truth. Operation Gladio stands as a monumental example of what happens when that balance is lost, and the state begins to view its own people as a potential obstacle. In the end, the mystery of the secret armies is not just a historical curiosity. It is a fundamental inquiry into the nature of power. It forces us to confront the idea that the stability we enjoy may be the product of invisible forces working in ways we can barely imagine. As we walk through the streets of modern cities, past the train stations and the government buildings, we are reminded that beneath the surface of everyday life, there may still be caches of secrets waiting to be unearthed. The sword may be sheathed, but the hand that held it has never truly let go. The most disturbing aspect of the Gladio narrative is not the violence itself, but the silence that followed it for 40 years. Thousands of people knew. Thousands of soldiers, intelligence officers, and politicians were aware that a secret world existed parallel to the one the public saw. They went to dinner, they cared for their families, and they participated in the rituals of democracy, all while keeping a secret that redefined the very nature of their country. This collective silence is the ultimate expression of a deep structure, a shared understanding that there are truths too dangerous to be spoken aloud. We are left with a landscape of unsolved mysteries and closed cases that seem to point toward a single, uncomfortable conclusion. The history of the late 20th century is not just a series of random events, but a choreographed sequence of pressures and releases designed to maintain a specific trajectory. The secret armies were the instruments of that choreography, the invisible stagehands who ensured the play went on as planned. Whether they were truly necessary for the survival of the West, or whether they were a manifestation of a paranoid elite, remains a matter of intense debate. As the fog of the Cold War continues to lift, more pieces of the puzzle may surface, but the full picture may always remain just out of reach. The nature of clandestine operations is to leave no trail, to ensure that every lead ends in a dead end or a redacted page. But the memory of the victims and the persistence of investigators ensure that the name Gladio will never be forgotten. It serves as a permanent mark on the record of the 20th century, a reminder that the greatest threats to a society can sometimes be born of a desire to protect that has lost its way in the dark. The story concludes not with a resolution, but with a lingering sense of unease. We are forced to look at the institutions we trust with a more critical eye, to ask who is watching the watchman, and to wonder what other secrets are currently being kept in the name of safety. The dark thriller of the secret armies is a story that has no final chapter, only a series of layers that we continue to peel back, hoping to find a core of truth in a world built on shadows. The sword is still there somewhere, hidden in the archives or buried in the earth, a silent witness to a conflict that was fought in the hearts of the very people it was supposed to save. If you ever find yourself in a quiet village in Europe, near an old forest or a forgotten bunker, remember that history is not always found in textbooks. Sometimes it is buried 6 feet under, waiting for someone to find the key. The ghosts of Gladio still haunt the corridors of power, a reminder that the most effective weapon is the one you never see coming, wielded by the person you never thought to fear. The truth is rarely simple, and in the world of secret armies, it is often the most dangerous thing of all. The sword remains forever sharp, forever silent, tucked away until the next time the world decides it needs a shadow to fight its battles.